I'm Chris Farrell, and this is On Watch. I'm Chris Farrell. Welcome to this special edition of On Watch. It's an hour-long segment. It's going to be live streamed on Judicial Watch and broadcast on the One American News Network. And we're very fortunate this morning to be broadcasting from the beautiful One America studios in Washington, D.C. Joining me for this special edition of On Watch is Rachel Bovard, Senior Policy Director at the Conservative Partnership Institute, Investigative Reporter for the Daily Caller News Foundation, and author of Obstruction of Justice, a great book on the Awan Brothers scandal, Luke Rosiak, and my colleague and friend, Michael Bekesha, Senior Attorney with Judicial Watch, who's usually up to his neck in all sorts of contentious litigation, trying to uncover what the government's really doing or not doing. So thank you all three of you for joining me on this special edition. We're very excited to have you here. Listen, the first topic I wanted to talk about probably is the dominant topic. Really, it covers, it stomps all other news, or at least it leads a lot of other news broadcasts. And in our discussion today, I'd really like your very frank assessment of what's going on, not just with the headlines, but kind of behind the scenes. I think that's really the value that we bring in a broadcast like this. And that is with respect to the Trump coup, and that's what I call it. It's a coup. It appears that we're done with phase one of the coup, but it also appears that phase two is ongoing. And when I say that, what I'm talking about really is this sort of drumbeat about obstruction, and the efforts to either hold the president accountable to this non-event. Mueller's report says no collusion, no conspiracy, but people haven't let go of it, right? There's folks on the Hill, obviously leading Democrats in the House, who just keep banging the drum. Is it real? Is this just a game? Is it a fundraising stunt?
Well, I think we knew this was coming, right? We knew the congressional Democrats were not going to be happy with whatever the Mueller report said. If it cleared him in any way, they were going to disregard it completely. Even though it took 2 years, how many millions of dollars, something like 45 attorneys, all these FBI agents, 500 subpoenas, and yet they are still not satisfied. And what I think is particularly interesting about this whole episode is to watch the tension right now in the Democrat Party, because you have the leadership who lived through Bill Clinton's impeachment and saw it backfire at Republicans, and the sort of very progressive wing of the Democrats, which is capturing the party. And they are all on board with impeachment. And so I'm sort of like, give me the popcorn, because this is a gift for the Democrats. For the Republicans, this is a gift.
Yeah, and I refer to that, what you refer to as the very progressive wing. I mean, they're Bolsheviks, right? They're so far to the left, they're beyond the pale. And, you know, their increasing hysteria, I think, as you pointed out, actually adds to sort of the president saying, see, I told you so.
Right.
Luke, let me ask you a question. In all of this, every time they scream impeachment, is it for real, or is it a publicity stunt, or a fundraising technique? What is it?
I think it's a way to just keep the ball moving forward. They can't acknowledge that what they tried to do was sort of this international scheme over several years to frame Donald Trump for a crime that he didn't commit. They can't acknowledge that. They have to keep talking about it as if we haven't learned these things that we've slowly learned over the last couple of years, because to acknowledge that is a reckoning that really, where do you go from there? But if you don't admit it and you just kind of double down, I mean, I think that's it's almost instinctual. It's like they're an animal that's cornered. I mean, they can't acknowledge that they were caught. They were busted.
I get that politically, but how about your colleagues, your journalist colleagues out there? There are folks who are so invested in this narrative, this outcome that they're just committed to. Where's the reckoning for them? How do they go in front of a camera or sit in front of their word processor and continue? I mean, is there no accountability?
It's really a sight to behold, and I think it's one of those cases where when everyone is implicated in it, then everyone gets away with it. You know, and no one wants to be, the dominoes would basically fall and take out everyone. And it's kind of similar when you look at the law enforcement agencies and even the various foreign countries that were involved in this. This is such a big scandal that it's in everyone's interest to pretend it didn't happen. And, the alternative to them talking about it is if they face the fact, if we, all these things that we've learned about how this was a setup, they say, oh, that was 2 years ago, move on, move on. But the thing is, if they would have gotten away with this and Clinton would be president, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So I don't think this is a case where if you attempt a coup and it fails, then you just get a free pass and they say move on. We shouldn't move on.
So the effort really is just double down, right? So you're caught with your hand in the cookie jar, and he said, well, what do you mean I'm eating cookies? Or what do you mean it's a counterintuitive doubling down because you can't possibly.
Absolutely. The Democrats are doubling down, and then the Republicans, it's what the Republicans are doing makes sense to try to delve into the origins of this dossier. And so you've got both parties kind of still talking about things that happened 2-3 years ago, which on one sense it's a bad thing because we can't deal with the policy issues that are in front of us right now. It's kind of a distraction from the actual work of governing. But at the same time, the Republicans frankly there should be a reckoning for the Democrats, and the Republicans should be continuing to examine the origins of all this, which has frankly only taken so long because the FBI is kind of stonewalling and they've been so secretive about the whole thing.
Well, I think, too, the Democrats are in a position where they want to keep moving this forward, but they are at odds with the rest of the American people. They don't want it. The American people, if you look at any polling on this, the American public is done with it. I mean, you have these fringe outliers, but they are ready to move on. They do not want impeachment. And so I don't know how Democrats are going to handle this because they are directly at odds. To your point, the American people want a legislative agenda from a party in the majority. That's what every American people wants from their majority. And you're not seeing it. You're seeing investigations, you're seeing hysteria, you're seeing non sequiturs all over the place.
But that's the problem. I mean, the Democrats are so out of touch with the American people. One, it's impeachment, but it's also on their policies. Mm-hmm. And so what are they going to do? Try to pass laws, pass legislation that the American people don't want? I mean, the Democrats they have to do this because otherwise the American people are going to know what they're about, and that's not good for them politically either. And
Michael, so you have to get a legal question, so brace up. Here it comes.
Oh, no.
The attorney has to get a legal question. There's these efforts by various committees to hold people in contempt and to go after the president's tax returns in a way that seems, I'm being generous when I say it's unorthodox. So again, a publicity stunt, a fundraising gimmick, or is there real legal validity to these various claims and maneuvers that you see coming out of committees?
Oh, it's all fundraising and gimmicks. I mean, every president claims executive privilege. I mean, President Obama did it all the time. This is what happens. You have two branches of government. They're not supposed to agree all the time. In fact, the system's set up for them to compete and argue back and forth. And so, sure, hold somebody in contempt. And then they'll negotiate a little bit more and a few documents will be released. And that's it. I mean, so
no court is going to weigh in and say, thou shalt release whatever.
The court could do so, but I mean, it happened when President Obama claimed executive privilege over the Fast and Furious documents. That case finally was settled 7 years later. Congress got a few records. They didn't get them until after Judicial Watch got them. So, sure, let them go to court, but it's not going to solve anything. I mean, let's get back to governing. Let's get back to making sure that our country's safe.
And there's a legitimate separation of powers question, right? Because the court could say, look, you two other co-equal branches are fighting among yourselves. Have fun, work it out. We're not going to step in and Bigfoot the
Absolutely. The courts do that all the time. And in this one instance, the court didn't do that. And they said, all right, we're going to resolve it. Well, what happened 6 years later? Congress and the executive branch went back to the court and said, we want you to vacate your ruling. We don't like the fact that you took this case. And so these branches, they don't want oversight from the other branches, and that's all you're seeing right now.
And this drags out this is
forever.
Months and years, right?
Absolutely.
But I think on this point, it's interesting, it should be noted that during the investigation, President Trump's administration was incredibly transparent. At no point did he claim executive privilege during the investigation. No. He didn't tell anyone not to testify. He made every person and document available. So I think he has a little bit of justification now to say, look, I cooperated with the process. The process worked, and now it's simply a witch hunt, and I will not, dignify the office or lower the dignity of the office by complying with this.
So much for obstruction, right? I mean, when you cooperate fully, when you have your White House counsel testify for 30 hours, right. When you turn over 1.4 million documents, when you don't claim executive privilege, that's all obstruction, right? It's kind of like when you hammer blackberries or use bleach bit on a server, oh, that's obstruction.
It was just
right?
wiped with a cloth, Chris.
Right.
Come on.
Like with a cloth.
Isn't that what cleaning it means?
Absolutely.
Well, and I think that's why this has to kind of play out in the political arenas and sort of on social media and in the news, because all these things are superficial and you don't necessarily have to know all the facts. You just have to repeat certain catchphrases. And in the court, you actually have to look at documents, you have to look at evidence. And we did that. We did that with the Mueller report, and that's where things kind of fell apart. And so even if I think they were trying to do impeachment, you have to make an argument. Who did what? It's not enough just to shriek the word Russia.
Right.
You have to articulate who did what, when, why, where, and how. And no one has ever been able to say what that wrongdoing is. It's just kind of, it's all smoke and mirrors, and this atmosphere that we're in now with sort of short attention spans and hyperpartisan media has kind of set this up, where underlying it all, there's very little substance to any of it.
So now the pendulum swings back the other way, and you have Attorney General Barr saying that he's going to investigate the investigators. He dared to use a regular, common, normal English word, spying, and everyone became hysterical. When in fact, the use of human intelligence and signals intelligence assets is in fact spying. Surprise, surprise. But he said that he's going to look at this now. We have Mr. Durham out of Connecticut. He's the guy who broke up the whole Whitey Bulger FBI corruption situation in Boston. So do Barr and Durham, do they really have a chance? Can they accomplish anything?
I mean, I hope so. I mean, can we say, is Bill Barr the biggest pleasant surprise of this administration? I mean, I don't think he was walking into a tornado, and no one knew how it was going to work out, but the guy has been rock-ribbed. And I think a lot of people appreciate from that. He does not take any BS, from sort of the left-wing media, from these crazy Democrats. He is kind of going for the jugular, and God bless him.
So, I mean, my only concern, and I take the Attorney General at his word, and I believe that he and Mr. Durham are going to do exactly what they said they're going to do. But of course, any good real investigation, everything gets kind of quiet for a while, right? Because you have people out doing interviews and collecting evidence and records and documents and doing all those sorts of investigative things that don't lead with headlines. And I don't think that Mr. Barr or Mr. Durham will really be too interested in leaks, unlike Mr. Comey, right? Who likes to hand out secret notes from meetings with the president to his professor buddy.
And then Instagram them.
Instagram them as well. So my concern, Michael, is that at the Justice Department, the Attorney General, despite his good intentions, is sitting on top of an institution that's essentially an army of Sally Yateses, right?
Yep.
There are who knows how many hundreds of attorneys within the Justice Department, the day in, day out headquarters DOJ Maine entity, that is not terribly well inclined or sort of in line with Mr. Barr's intentions.
I mean, yeah, we see that all the time. You would think that with the Trump administration here that we'd be getting more records, that we wouldn't be seeing these battles in court, battles that are getting nastier than they were even under the Obama administration. And that's all because on the ground floor, no one has changed, right? Everybody's still there. And so even if he's trying to do the investigation, one, who's going to talk, two, what records still exist? I mean, if you're going to have a coup, you're probably going to cover it up, right? You're probably not going to save your emails. And then when somebody asks, so where are your emails about the coup? Oh, here they are. They're in a box. I put them right here for you.
Right.
So, I mean, it's going to be tough. It's going to be a challenge. But I think, we need to see what's going to happen, and hopefully we move in the right direction.
Here's another wild card for you. Christopher Wray, the FBI director. In my opinion, here's a guy who's interested in two things: damage control and preserving the institution of the FBI. So he's been remarkably uncourageous in cleaning house in an organization that I think has some pretty grave problems within it. Part of it is sort of the institutional, we're the FBI, we know what we're doing, go away, Another part of it, I think, is that there's probably a number of people in the institution with guilty knowledge. They could not have pulled this off and just kept it to a clique of a dozen people, right? There's a lot of people who know a lot of stuff. And so Christopher Wray goes in front of Congress and says something like, with respect to the term spying, he goes, no, we were engaged in court-authorized electronic surveillance and confidential human source activity. Well, in regular plain English, our viewers know that that's spying, right? So Christopher Wray, what role is he going to play in all this?
It's an open question.
Yeah.
That's a tough one. I don't know.
Because I think it is. And perhaps your silence is consent, right?
I think I
think that the evaluation is it's damage control. He doesn't want to see the institution harmed any further, and he's trying to minimize, the rank and file agents out in the field and kind of the negative blowback to them. And it's also preserving the institution of the FBI.
Well, I think he has, sort of a big existential role, to your point, about preserving the integrity of the institution. We get a lot into the details about, who did this and who did that, but we don't talk about the fact that Americans don't trust our institutions anymore, especially on the justice side, and that is a huge problem. That is a huge, I think, threat to the democracy. We talk about coups and all these things, but when people don't trust the institutions to have their best interests and to be impartial and be fair, I don't know how he overcomes that. I think at some point there's going to have to be a purge, of individuals that were associated with a lot of this for people to start trusting the FBI, trusting the Department of Justice, and really feeling the confidence in their government again.
But
Yeah,
we
that's-
also,
go ahead.
we also know, though, back during the Clinton investigation, President Obama went on TV, went on 60 Minutes, and said nothing happened, right? She didn't do anything wrong. We know there have been reports that FBI agents were extremely unhappy that the President of the United States was going on and essentially interfering with the investigation. And so there are good people still in the FBI. We just need to make sure they're the ones that are, leading the FBI in the future.
But I think Jill's point is such a great one, and it's something that we don't often talk about. I mean, there are long-term impacts of what Hillary Clinton and her cabal did, dating back to 2015, about sort of the integrity of our country. And it's really sad when you think about it that they wanted to win that badly in a political race that they were willing to sort of torch the credibility of these institutions, because we are a country that's a lot bigger than Democrat versus Republican. We have a long history of being basically a first world country. Means you can kind of trust these institutions. When you look at the third world, everyone's lying, everyone's scamming, you don't know what's real, and we already have enough trouble in America with two different sets of opinions. When you can't trust the fact gatherers anymore, and now you've got Americans who are dealing with two separate sets of facts, you've sown the seeds of really long-term societal discord. And it's, we are now almost a low-trust society, which is kind of a phrase used to describe third world countries. So I often think about exactly that point that Jill made. Hillary Clinton, what she did was just a really sad thing too. And these Bruce Orr and Peter Strzok and the rest of them, I mean, they were expending something that wasn't theirs to expend, which is the credibility of this institution.
And the public trust.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And Rachel, when you take a look at what was done from the Peter Strzok, Comey world at that level, you had the full weight and authority of the FBI, Department of Justice, and for that matter, the intelligence arms of their powers, not just the law enforcement arms. And they very craftily, and really in an insidious way, manufactured a foreign counterintelligence event. I'm talking about the Carter Page, Papadopoulos situations. And they deliberately sort of launched those overseas so that they could call them foreign counterintelligence investigations, and then very deliberately imported them back into the United States to run them. They knew exactly what they were doing. There were no mistakes here. This wasn't this just popped up on our radar screen and we're reacting to. They willfully and deliberately set this up, and they knew it. I mean, a few weeks back we were talking with Carter Page. For years before any of this nonsense started, when he was traveling to Russia and coming back, he was actually an informant in the sense of he was a legal traveler who debriefed with the FBI and provided them information about who he met with, what he saw, et cetera. And for them to take that and so deliberately twist it, I think it goes to your point about this notion that public faith and confidence in institutions like the FBI and Department of Justice has been so eroded. There are consequences to that. How do you rehab that? How do you fix that?
I think you have to start with transparency. You have to start with accountability. I mean, there has to be a reckoning, I think, a little bit. There has to be a very public reckoning for what happened. I think we need to talk about the details. We need to hold people accountable. And we need to do it in a way that is very transparent and public and that people can understand. Because to Luke's point, our government rests on this idea that we give people the public trust, we expect them to use it in our interest, and when they don't, there has to be consequences. And that is what sets us apart from low trust societies, is that that there isn't this elite that sort of just pulls the puppet strings and decides outcomes and gets away with it. And that literally was unimaginable maybe 50 years ago. But this is the situation we're in right now. And it's shocking and appalling, and I think the only thing fixing it is a reckoning and accountability.
That is a great summary. Thank you very much, Rachel. Don't touch that remote. You're not allowed to. Stay tuned. We're going to come back in a few moments and pick up another exciting topic on this special edition of On Watch. Welcome back to On Watch. I'm Chris Farrell, and I'm joined today in this special edition with some great guests. Rachel Bovard from Conservative Partnership Institute, reporter Luke Rosiak from Daily Caller Foundation, and senior Judicial Watch attorney Michael Bekesha. We've got another great topic to cover. This one I think you're going to love. We're going to start off with a video clip, and this is a sort of walking hallway interview of Senator Lindsey Graham as he comes out of a hearing, a Judiciary Committee hearing, and he's talking about the crisis on our border. Let's watch this video.
It's clear what the problem is. We need a multifaceted approach, but no amount of money going to Central America will stop the problem unless we change our laws. No wall will stop this problem. They're not trying to avoid detection. They're trying to be caught, claim asylum, or bring a small child under the current, under the current system. Nothing will ever change until you change these laws. Having said that, I'm willing to invest more in Central America because we do have to get to the root cause of the problem. I'm certainly willing to spend more money on humanitarian assistance to the border. I'm willing to do a lot of things, but nothing will fix this problem unless we pass my bill.
I think that's a very interesting clip from Senator Graham. He's usually a pretty straight shooting, straight talking kind of guy. So is that the answer? Another piece of legislation that'll fix everything?
Well, at least Congress is talking about doing something.
Yeah.
Because they
One house is. I'm not sure about the other house.
They've had years to address this problem, and they've done nothing.
Right.
And what's interesting to watch is Congress sort of come to life when President Trump threatens to do something about immigration, failing at all to draw the parallel between their lack of action requiring Trump's action. And so I'm pleased to hear him talk about some kind of legislation because, I mean, the border is in a crisis. We are at the highest level of crossers in 13 years. When President Obama declared a humanitarian crisis in 2014, we have now surpassed in just 6 months the total number of crossers in that year. And it's not just a security crisis, it's a humanitarian crisis as well. And Congress has done, let me think, nothing.
Right. And we're going to talk about that humanitarian crisis in just a little bit. Luke, is there something that can be done, not just legislatively, but there are already lots and lots of rules and regulations on the books that if Homeland Security, ICE, Border Patrol would actually aggressively pursue what's available to them, can we make improvements?
I think that's where a lot of the disconnect happens, where we talk about needing new policies when the issue is you're not enforcing the current rules. I mean, they're talking about, we need only humanitarian aid, but not to do something about the underlying problem. And that's kind of the classic Democrat thing, is instead of giving a man a fishing pole so he can fish, you're just giving him a loaf of bread. This is a short-term. This is a Band-Aid. What they're talking about, just to throw some money at the issue so they can eat or whatever. We need to deal with the masses of people who are coming into our country and addressing that root cause. It doesn't really make any sense just to slap a Band-Aid on the problem.
Judicial Watch engaged in an active journalism back in October. We went down to Guatemala. My colleague Irene Garcia from our Corruption Chronicles blog and another colleague, Sarah Carter, we went to Guatemala because we thought that, look, instead of sitting in a studio in New York or Washington and just endlessly talking about it, we'd actually go and visit with the people in Guatemala. And so we went from marching along the road with folks in the so-called caravan all the way up to the presidential palace and had an hour-and-a-half interview with the president of Guatemala. So we got a full spectrum look at this. Interestingly, when we were talking to, we were getting set up for the interview with the president, Jimmy Morales, his press secretary came over and said, you're the only Americans that have ever come and asked for an interview. So think about that, right? All the experts, all the talking heads, all the geniuses who know what the solutions are for everything. We were the first, and I think there's been subsequent interviews, we were the first persons to ever go to Guatemala, which is really the choke point, right? You're not getting through Mexico unless you pass Guatemala.
Right.
And in my view, Guatemala is actually our new southern border.
And I
because-
think that's deliberate, Chris, that they don't want to gather those facts because that takes away their talking points. It's easier to deal with these things in emotional terms. You're talking about a poor orphan who's like straight out of, Oliver Twist.
Yep.
And you don't want to deal with the facts, which is these people are coming in and they know the lines to say. They've rehearsed them and they know what to say to trigger the different, basically checking boxes on a form so that you're then, you're let into the country and then you don't show up for the asylum hearing. But when you've got 90% of people skipping the hearing for asylum, it's kind of like you do the same thing again and again. It's just insanity at some point. I mean, you can't allow a process to continue when you've got essentially a 90% fraud rate.
Yeah, well, let's be clear about how to fix that, though. The president can, and I think is doing as much as he can in the face of a lot of opposition from Congress. But the asylum process has to be fixed statutorily. I mean, these are laws Congress passed. Loopholes in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, all these things have to be fixed by statute. The president has only so many knobs he can turn, and I think he's doing that. And Republicans in his own party are fighting him. But Congress really, the fault lies with them, and they have apparently zero interest in addressing it. They want to talk about the crisis, but they don't want to do anything about it.
Michael, the legal process entails asylum hearings in front of these sort of administrative law judges who hold them. And we know for a fact, it's been documented, that the left has sent down people across the border to give magic language, right, to folks entering the country. In a practical sense, how in the world do the administration, the legal administration for processing these people, how does it get unsorted? There's like hundreds of thousands of people in a queue.
I mean, yes, it's a complete mess, and passing new laws isn't going to fix that in the short term. Enforcing the law, you start enforcing it now, I mean, it's almost too much of a mess to do so, right? If you haven't been enforcing the law for 10, 15 years, and you try to start doing that now, you're not going to be able to.
Well, Trump did that with family separation policy, and that was a disaster.
Yeah, I mean, there's just no easy way to go from doing nothing to doing something, even if the laws are on the books. I mean, so who knows what the easy answer is? I think the president's trying. I think members of Congress could try to do more, but really it's going to take money. I mean, right? You're going to need more administrative law judges. You're going to need more folks at the border making sure people are showing up to their hearings. I mean, it's all these process steps, and if you have more money and you have more resources, you have more people, boots on the ground, you can help get people from point A to point B to point C.
So Border Patrol enforcement, not necessarily with respect to actual persons crossing the border, but on the other side of the equation, and we're talking now also the enforcement side of drug trafficking, not the human smuggling aspect of it. The cartels are now laughing. I've heard from any number of sources, and fortunately we have sources on both sides of the border. The cartels are laughing because all the effort has been shifted to, I don't say this lightheartedly, I mean they're doing child care. They're trying to move people around and keep account of them. And it's health and welfare and all the mechanics really of this humanitarian crisis. But the bad guys are exploiting this and laughing all the way to the bank. They could not possibly care any less. So Judicial Watch came up with a white paper not too long ago where we laid out one possibility for the president to act on. And when you peel through all the stories and saga around Mexico and the border, who controls Mexico? The cartels do, right? That's who really can. They get politically on the ground through their criminal network. And so we propose that the president declare the Mexican cartels to be foreign terrorist organizations. Right now, they're considered transnational criminal organizations. Only DC could come up with a title like transnational criminal organization. But designating them as foreign terrorist organizations would change the dynamics radically. We would come off defense, where we run around trying to catch people or catch drug dealers, and instead we go on the offense. And we have the ability through both armed forces and intelligence operations to take the fight to the cartels, because they're calling the shots, they're making the money, they're trafficking the people and smuggling the drugs into the country. So some folks have said, oh, this is a very radical idea, how could you? Here's my explanation for it. If we're going to take the time to call the Iranian Revolutionary Guard a terrorist organization, we need to call the cartels in Mexico a terrorist organization. Arguably, the cartels pose a greater, more imminent threat to the safety and lives and property of Americans than the Iranian Revolutionary Guard does. And so Some people have said, "Oh, that's a step too far. It's too strong." What do you think about the idea of the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations?
I think you have to look at the size and scope of the problem justifying an action like that, because a Rand Corporation study was recently released a month or so ago looking at how much money the cartels are making from criminal activity at our border, and they put it at $2.3 billion just in 2017.
Right.
I mean, this is a tremendous criminal enterprise. And I recently sat down with Congressman Michael Cloud from the 27th District of Texas. He had just taken some members to the border. And he was telling me this story. He was in the Laredo sector of the border. They have these cameras that are at our southern border from the 1990s. They work maybe 75% of the time. And meanwhile, the cartels are flying drones overhead, like state of the art.
I'm always impressed that my doorbell at home has better quality picture than what you see at the border.
And
Right,
speaking of pictures, we have to take a quick break. So keep this picture on your television set. We'll be back with this special edition of On Watch. Welcome back to this special edition of On Watch. I'm Chris Farrell. One of the stories that I wanted to bring up or talk about is one actually that, Rachel, you brought to my attention with respect to the funding of to take care of, to address the humanitarian crisis around the problem at the border. It's quite a problem. But give us an idea of the tension within the Democratic Party.
I'm very interested in this story because I think it makes clear the hypocrisy of Democrats on this issue to a really shocking degree. And so we've talked about sort of the border crossing crisis, but you also have a humanitarian crisis at the border because families are coming across with young children. And to your point about resources, right, Border Patrol's out of space, they're out of money. And so 5 weeks ago, the Trump administration sent a request to Congress for $4.5 billion just for humanitarian purposes, to feed children, take care of sick kids, trafficked women. Sex trafficking at the border is a huge problem now. Democrats have been blocking this humanitarian funding. Again, this is not to build a wall. This is not for any border enforcement. This is strictly to take care of sick kids and trafficked women. And you are seeing loudest opposition from Democrats, supposedly the party of compassion, who hated everything President Trump did with family separation.
Let's name names. Who's blocking it?
Well, I would say the Democrat leadership on the floor is blocking it, to be honest, with some of the consent of Republicans in the Senate. Right? Mitch McConnell has done nothing to bring this bill to the floor, to force them to actually publicly do it. So they are able to hide behind his complicit, failing to bring it to the floor.
Right.
And you saw this actually yesterday when the House was debating a spending bill. And you saw members of the House Freedom Caucus, led by Chip Roy, a border state from Texas, come down and say, I'm objecting to everything because we have a crisis and we are not addressing it. And you saw every member of the Democrat Party get up and object. We are not going to fund this money for the border. We are not going to address this humanitarian crisis. We care about kids, but we can't give President Trump this money just to do a humanitarian mission. And I think this is rank hypocrisy on their part.
Luke, it's schizophrenic.
How
do they get away with it?
I don't know, but I mean, as far as giving money, we don't need it to be too comfortable. When they complain over here about, the shelters aren't adequate enough, I mean, if they are refugees, it should be a step up. And I think that we don't want a situation where we're creating this inducement of it. There's this reward when you come to America, so then people are sex trafficked in and child trafficked in. It doesn't make any sense. And you look at people like Ilhan Omar, who came over as refugees and are frankly completely ungrateful and probably don't love America. We don't kind of need that. And one of the tests is, if you are truly, if you're fleeing civil war, if you're fleeing this kind of immense, really agony in your home country, then when you get to America, you're probably going to be feeling pretty good if we give you a roof over your head, and you probably won't be complaining that much. And so I think it's a little silly, the constant talk by Democrats about, are we treating these people enough? Of course we don't want to, put anyone in harm's way, but we have to look at what are they fleeing specifically? What is the civil war that each of these countries is engaged in that is the specific reason? Because I don't think hearing cases on an individual basis of, my husband was beating me, so I needed to come to America. They can deal with that on their own. If there are specific global conflicts that people are fleeing, I think these should be, eligible for asylum on a country-by-country basis, but not sort of on an individual ad hoc basis. Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, you mentioned Ilhan Omar. This is the type of hypocrisy they're allowed to get away with, because she put out a tweet and complaining or condemning the overcrowding at the border. There was a CNN report about the IG saying it's way too overcrowded, while at the same time blocking funding to fix that problem.
Here's a novel idea for you. How about we don't process people to come into the country unless there's bed space. So instead of just, because my understanding, however imperfect it may be, my understanding is that the lineup just continues and they keep processing, even though they don't have adequate bed space.
Yeah.
And so it might make sense to tie the processing rate to the bed space. And that's one way to slow things down.
Well, I mean, you also have the problem, the humanitarian crisis you talk about at the border with the folks coming across the border, but also has the trickle-down effects, right? We don't have enough beds at the border, so a lot of these people are being released into communities. Let's take California, for example. So where are they going to go? Now you have nonprofits, churches, the Catholic Church houses a lot of these people. And what does that do? That prevents American citizens that have been here that may be homeless, that were relying on the shelters at the churches, relying on nonprofits for food on a daily basis. Now where are they going to go? And so the humanitarian crisis is at the border, but it's also trickling down and going into our communities, and we're just going to have more and more homelessness and issues until we have more beds or people are being sent back.
With respect to asylum, I mentioned earlier this idea of a foreign terrorist organization designation for cartels. Well, here's another idea. This one may be a little radical, but bear with me. What if, and this has been done before, other places, other countries, other times, it's not that radical. What if we declared a security zone in certain portions of the border, and with the cooperation or coordination of the Mexican government, we put a 100-yard buffer zone inside Mexico and have that administered or manned by U.S. military. And what that does is creates the situation where people are not crossing the border and immediately claiming asylum. This 100-yard buffer zone is, we understand you want to come, but you're not going to set foot on American soil. Because once you do, it starts this cascade effect. And so the Mexicans are purportedly trying to assist and help in slowing the flow on their southern border from Guatemala. But does the United States have the right to defend itself? Can we set up a 100-yard deep buffer zone and just say, you're not going to get near the border. We're simply not going to permit it.
No, absolutely. And I think that's actually one of the things that President Trump was working on with Mexico in his negotiations when he threatened tariffs and got them to the table. That was one of the things he put on the table. He said, look, we want to keep these asylum seekers in Mexico. You need to help us keep them there. And I think that's an ongoing negotiation, but I think to your point, it's absolutely appropriate. And to your point about the beds, this is, I think, again, the hypocrisy of Democrats. They want catch and release. They want us to not have enough bed space, so they have to catch people and release them into the country. Case in point, in January of last year during shutdown negotiations, they knew ICE had 50,000 people in custody. They refused to allow Republicans to fund any more beds than 36,000.
We've got a lot more coming up. Stay tuned for this special edition of On Watch. Welcome back to this special edition of On Watch. I'm Chris Farrell. We're going to pick up where we left off with respect to the certain element of either dishonesty or disingenuousness when it comes to some of these government activities we've been talking about in the broader sense. Michael, we do a ton of litigation. In fact, we are the leading FOIA litigator in U.S. courts, actually for the last 18 years. Nobody does more FOIA requests or litigates more FOIA cases than Judicial Watch. And when I say FOIA, I use that acronym. I use it as a gerund, right? We're FOIA-ing. That's the Freedom of Information Act, the federal open records law that allows us to get access to government records and documents. Have you seen a shift from the Obama-era Department of Justice to the Trump-era Department of Justice when it comes to litigating our cases?
Generally, I'd say no. If there's any shift at all, it's probably a worse shift.
Worse?
DOJ has, are less willing to negotiate on terms, less willing to try and resolve cases in a timely fashion. So I think it's worse, which you would think would be the reverse, but it's not the case. A great example is we're currently fighting still over Hillary Clinton's emails. We have discovery, we're taking depositions, we're trying to get records, and the court, Judge Lamberth in this case, went to the unusual step to allow us to depose a State Department lawyer about what they knew during litigation about Secretary Clinton's emails. And he ruled again last night on some records. He said, this is the extraordinary case. This is a case that we want to know if the court and Judicial Watch and the American public was lied to by the lawyers. And we're trying to get to the bottom of that, but there really hasn't been a change at all.
I have to punctuate that comment of yours because to our viewers and to my friends here, You know, of all these cases that we litigate in federal court over the Freedom of Information Act, it is a tiny, tiny percentage that ever get discovery. And discovery meaning we're able to ask the opposing side either written interrogatories or take depositions. Normally it's just, okay, here's a scheduled production. You need to give us documents on these dates.
And then the court usually buys whatever the government's selling and gives them deference. So,
Yeah,
but we've had 2 cases with discovery in the past 4 years, which probably are the only 2 discovery cases in FOIA around the country in the past 4 years.
It's extraordinary. And so you have 2 very different judges also, just sort of their personality, judicial temperament, their style, Judge Emmett Sullivan and Judge Royce Lamberth, who have been so offended, so aggravated at the behavior and conduct of the State Department and the Department of Justice that they've gone to these extra lengths and allow us to go in and ask these questions. It may not seem like a big deal, but let me tell you, in our business and what we do when it comes to getting records and documents, this is off the charts. But what it really is an indicator of just how incredibly corrupt and dishonest people at the Department of State and Department of Justice are with respect to these records and documents. They know very well the questions we're asking and what we're looking for, and they're doing everything they can to dissemble, lie, obfuscate. It's horrendous.
Yeah, I mean, another example of a case I have, we're representing a former FBI agent, Jeffrey Danick, and he asked for records about McCabe, and he wanted his text messages and his emails, and the FBI is not even searching the text messages. They've decided, them and the Justice Department has decided that text messages aren't subject to FOIA, that we just don't get them. He also provided specific search terms, and this is the first time I've ever seen the Justice Department go to court and argue, well, if we give you search terms, we don't have to follow those. Usually they're calling us, asking us, well, what terms would you like to search? Because they don't want to have to think about it.
Suddenly they're not interested.
They're not interested anymore, so.
We hope that you are interested and that you stay tuned, because when we come back, we're going to do a quick recap on the most underreported news items of the last week. Welcome back to this special edition of On Watch. I'm Chris Farrell, and I'm joined by an all-star lineup here of folks here in Washington, D.C., who can give you the real behind-the-scenes story of what's happening in our nation's capital. So we have a lightning round. Get ready. What is the most underreported news story of the last week? We'll start with Rachel.
Well, I don't know if any of you saw the Hill's headline recently, which I think should get more attention than it did. But we talked about the border crisis. The Border Patrol is now moving children to Fort Sill as a place to house them. The Hill calls it a former Japanese internment camp, failing to point out that it is in fact just an Army base.
It is an Army base in the home of the artillery.
Yes.
It's a very important, very vibrant Army base that's been around since the 1860s.
Ridiculous.
Luke, what are we missing?
I've got a story up today on the Daily Caller about AJ Plus, which is Al Jazeera's branch. This Qatar-owned, really foreign propaganda outlet is manufacturing liberal viral videos on Facebook, and it's actually the number 8 most popular viral video maker on Facebook. And so it attacks America as being, not giving enough rights to women, not giving enough rights to labor unions and workers, basically being homophobic. And all this is coming from an ultra-conservative Sharia regime where foreigners are kept as slaves, literally.
And that piece of agitation propaganda needs to be exposed for what it is, and you're doing great reporting. When we come back, we'll have a wrap-up of this week's show and some closing thoughts. So stay tuned. Welcome back to this special edition of On Watch. So time has flown. We've had a blast doing the show, but I want to get to a couple of sort of thematic things. We've talked about the coup against President Trump. We've talked about the border crisis. We've talked about sort of disingenuous cover-ups within the Department of Justice and Department of State, funding or the lack thereof by Democrats trying to hold back money. What are some other topics that you're working on or looking at in this next week coming up?
Well, I think there's a lot of attention right now on what happened in the House yesterday. For those of you who didn't see it, the House considered a spending bill, and the House Freedom Caucus, led again by Chip Roy, forced votes on 106 amendments. So he kept the House in for a very long time, forced them to do their job.
They get very fussy when they're kept in session
When
that
they
long.
cannot go to bed on time, when they miss their fundraisers, that is just the worst thing in the world. But they have to do their jobs, basically.
Right.
And so props to those guys for actually making the House do their job.
That is pretty amazing. And
Yeah.
this, again, the schizophrenia within the House is something that I don't think is going to go away anytime soon. Michael, when it comes to sort of this ongoing legal battles that we have in getting records and documents, as you're looking out over the horizon, I know it's dangerous for an attorney to predict things, but as you look out over the horizon, what are some cases, what are some developments that you think really kind of portend or at least give us an indication of where Judicial Watch's work is going?
I mean, I think looking at investigating the investigators. I mean, whether or not the Attorney General and his appointed U.S. Attorney are going to get to the bottom of it, I'm not sure. All I know is Judicial Watch has dozens at this point, lawsuits in federal court seeking records doing just that, looking for the communications with Christopher Steele in the State Department. Now we learn that it's the State Department as well as members of Congress that was learning about the dossier way before anybody else. Communications with former Director Comey, communications with Mueller, kind of just seeing what's out there. And then our ongoing battles to get the text messages and the emails between Lisa Page and Peter Strzok.
I have to always kind of do this to blow our own horn, but I think it's important for folks to realize that when they see all these emails and text messages from various characters around this coup against the president, I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say 85 to 90% of that material is a direct result of Judicial Watch litigation. The fact that Hillary Clinton was running an outlaw email server, the public would never have known if it wasn't for our litigation. That's what exposed it and forced them to do this sham investigation that Comey did. But if we had not sued on that, and really the roots to that, believe it or not, were Benghazi. Our investigation of that horrific terrorist attack resulting in the death of 4 Americans, we got records and documents, and who was conspicuously absent in all the email traffic back and forth about what was going on? Hillary Clinton was conspicuously absent. And after the case was actually closed 10 months later, State Department and Justice Department came back to us very sheepishly and said, we have another universe of documents. We said, another universe of documents, what would that be? And then they revealed the existence of her server. And so, when you look at the Trump coup conspiracy, you can walk it back to the Hillary Clinton email server, because essentially she was a national security crime suspect, right, having violated.
Wasn't there a PowerPoint presentation that your department got that kind of showed that too?
Exactly. There's an entire layout of all the crimes that they suspected her of committing. And having a past life as a counterintelligence special agent, I can tell you she certainly meets the threshold, without a doubt. But it all actually walks itself back to Benghazi, believe it or not. And that's a kind of a long trail, but when you start pulling that string, that's where it actually leads to, which is pretty amazing. So the fight continues, and Attorney General Barr and Mr. Durham are going to do what they're going to do. But one thing I can assure you is Judicial Watch is going to keep doing what we do, because we never forget, we don't quit, we stick with it, and we fight in our own way to uncover government records and documents.
We have great partners like the Daily Caller that we work with. Some of our most recent documents we got with his colleague Chuck Ross. So, we're not in it alone, but it's good to have some help.
Listen, I want to thank all of you for joining us here on this special edition of On Watch. You've added so much to the conversation, really given us some depth and some insight as to what's really going on in Washington, D.C. I'm Chris Farrell, On Watch.